Good evening. Tonight we have like two or three topics basically I wanted to share with you or discuss or give you some food for thought. The first one being is the news out of Germany has been that the gas deliveries via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline now has been reduced by 40%, and the Russians are saying that the shortage is basically due to a issue with a turbine, to pump the stuff into the pipelines on Russian territory. And that turbine is made in Canada, and the Canadians cannot send any parts for a new turbine to increase the pressure, I guess, to put this through the underground pipeline. This is now Nord Stream 1. So in response to this, the German government, this was reported by various German news outlets, not just by one, it said that the Germans needed to prepare for a cold winter. And the strategy now is to conserve gas, is that they would reduce the amount of electricity produced by natural gas power plants and go back to coal plants or coal power plants. And it is interesting, because the reactors, the nuclear, most of them have been decommissioned or driven, stopped producing electricity since Merkel came up with this ingenious idea to go out of nuclear power altogether because of the earthquake we had. I think it was, when was it, 2010 or 2012 in Japan. And the problems the earthquake caused there to that nuclear power plant and this, that, and the other thing. So now in order to reduce the gas consumption, natural gas consumption, and make more gas available to the general public and the industry, which badly needs that, they're going to shift back to coal power plant, which they actually didn't want to do. Now, with that being said, the underlying issue here is we had Scholz's visit last week, Scholz, Scholz, to the Ukraine, and he met with Zelensky, and with him was the Italian fellow, Macron. No, that was the French one, and now I forgot the name of the Italian fellow again. It wasn't Berlusconi, it was the other one, Draghi. Yeah, Mario Draghi. They went there to talk to Zelensky, and Scholz did not answer any more questions about more weapons deliveries and heavy weapons deliveries directly to the collected media, the reporters, when he was asked there if there was more coming. And out of Poland, there is some voices coming out, and they said that Germany is doing this just not to deliver any weapons or heavy weapons to the Russians because they want the gas after the war. And if you're looking now at the strategies, the way the German government is dealing with it, there is probably some merit to it, because they will go with the coal rather than powering up the nuclear plants, which would be much easier to get nuclear material. For one is the quantities are much smaller, and you have no CO2 emissions with nuclear power, none. So you had a choice there. You could have, started the power reactors. You have to deal then, of course, with the nuclear waste. But on the other hand, is you would have no CO2 emissions. So instead of shifting the power from natural gas back to nuclear power, which can produce clean and fairly cheap electricity, they're going with coal, which is even a bigger polluter. And they reasoning, this is what I think, is it's only temporary. And because of the whole high gas prices, all around the world, people probably going to be driving less. So they're going to be producing less CO2. So they're going to use coal, and they're going to get a trade-off there with the reduced vehicle emissions versus the coal production additional emissions coming out of the coal power plants. And so as soon as this is over with the war, they're basically going to go back to the gas deal with the Russians. This I can see. This is sort of fitting together when you really think about this. Now, with this being said, is the question of why the Ukraine actually needs the West for weapons. Okay, now I have some statistics here, which came from Oberst or Colonel Markus Reisner from the Austrian Armed Forces, and he gave us a rundown, and he said the Ukraine had 2,416 tanks of various makes and models, mostly of the Soviet type, or virtually all of them of the Soviet types. So these T-72s, then they had T-84s and that sort of stuff. All of the earlier model and probably older ones. And they had 535 multiple launch rocket systems, MLRSs, and they had 1,509 artillery weapons available. These are the launch system, the artillery units, 155 millimeter, or whatever they're using. This was all left over from the Soviet days. Now, this is a tremendous amount of tanks, 2,416 tanks. If you think about it, Germany has, I think right now the Bundeswehr has 200 to 300. We had 1,500 or 2,000 during the height of the Cold War, not even close to the 2,400. There's not one single country in Germany which has that many tanks. I think the United States may have some in that number. They may even have more. That is what I would guess as the biggest NATO contributor. Now, besides this, the main tank facilities they have are in Kharkiv. That is the, I hope I'm going to say this now correctly, Malyashev tank factory, and they were basically converting the old T-84 tanks into Oplot tanks, OPLOT, and that had been ongoing for 10 years, and they were doing actually quite well because they made 110 million US dollars between in the year 2017 to 2018. So virtually 4 or 5 years ago, before this war ever started. The interesting thing is Kharkiv is the city they're fighting for right now, where there's still a lot of battle going on up there. And that tank factory was taken out by the Russians almost a week within the war starting on March 2nd. They bombed the hell out of this thing. And from the pictures I've looked up, there's not much left of this whole industrial area over there. That's a pretty large size factory, and that used to be a factory for locomotives, and it was then converted, it was then converted to a tank facility sometimes in the last 10-15 years or so, in that range. So they did have a factory. Now, the other factory, interestingly enough, is the Mykolaiv factory. And Mykolaiv is Laiv. Mykolaiv, Mykolaiv, is a few miles southwest of Odessa. And they were doing that's the Mykolaiv armored plant there, and they were building these armored transport carriers there. And they had been redesigning the old Soviet Unions to what they call Mongoose. And those are these armored transport carriers, what you see, where you can get people in and out, soldiers in and out of the field. And they produced about 400 of them per year. Now, this is my question now in this, knowing this. And then there's another tank factory in Lviv, which is Lemberg in German, in the Lviv tank factory. So we have now 2 facilities basically out. The one in Odessa, which the Russians haven't got to yet, but I'm pretty sure that they have shelled it. I wouldn't be surprised. And the one in Kharkiv, which we know for sure is completely destroyed. And now whatever is left in Lviv, and I was not fully able to find out of what tanks they were actually building in Lviv. And I do not know where they were building the artillery. So my guess would be that the Russian military has basically probably shelled all of these manufacturing sites. For sure, even the one in Lviv, I'm pretty sure was that they were trying to get to this to disrupt this. My question would be, since the whole Donbas conflict has been going on since the fall of 2014, why didn't the Ukrainians move the Kharkiv Malyashev tank factory and relocated that, combined it with Lviv, built a larger facility there, and also moved the Mykolaiv Mongoose armored plant fan facility over there and whatever else they had. These areas, they're very, very close to the Donbas region. And I think anyone with half a brain could have guessed, if you're that close to, to the battlefield, to the battle theater, your tank factories, armored for all of this stuff is not safe. Now, we know this is all old Soviet equipment. Either the Ukrainians, if they have all this equipment, they must have had a facility where they built ammunition for this, or multiple facilities. You cannot have 2,416 Soviet tanks, even when they're modified, or 1,500 artillery, units, without having the ammunitions, MLRSs, 535 of them, without having a production going on somewhere. And I do not know what the status is of the ammunitions factories and the chemical plants which, build or produce the raw ingredients you need in order to produce the ammunition for those, besides of the metal machining which has to be done to build the shell cases for all of the stuff. This is not quite clear. So I do not know on how they thought they're going to do this, but they have known since 2014 with the Russian separatist movement over there in the Donbas region that was an armed conflict, and that the Russians have been involved pretty much since the day one, since they started there in the fall of 2014. So the entire planning leaves me bamboozled, because even though we had political changes there, the people who run these factories, they must have been aware, or they should have been aware, that there is a potential threat for them to become a immediate target of the Russian army or the Russian military in a case that the conflict further escalates as to the point as what we got now. But it looks like it that they had made no preparations whatsoever, at least from what I have been able to gather on the internet. They operated basically until the day they were bombed, which was for Kharkiv on March 2nd. So this leaves me with the question is on how the Ukrainians actually have viewed their own national defense. That raises some serious questions. I do not want to get into the subject whether the Ukraine is corrupt or not, because this really doesn't have anything to do with corruption, but with thorough assessment of situations, geopolitical situations, and the assessment of the whole Donbas conflict and what the Russians were doing and not doing. And to a certain extent, the politics are involved in this. Now, we know from Poland and other, Eastern European countries, which are now members of NATO, that they have sent their Soviet surplus equipment over with the ammunition they had. I believe there is a facility in Bulgaria which still makes the ammunition for those old Soviet-style, artilleries and tanks they were using within NATO. Because if they were active inventory, that means they had to be supplied with weapons in the case that it came to a conflict where they needed to be used. And so that seems to be an option there too. Now, with all of this being said, it is a question that what happened to the 2,400 tanks? We haven't seen them on a battlefield, and 2,400 tanks is more, again, than any other European country has currently, even remotely close to this, not even combined. I think they may have that much. The only country I know of which has at least that number in Abrams tanks and similar, mostly Abrams tanks, is the United States. So with this, we're looking at a situation now when the Ukraine says, well, help us, then can you explain to us of what your defense strategy was with the manufacturing of this equipment and the ammunition, and explain to us of why you're suddenly out of it? Why didn't you move this? Okay, we know now that you have issues. The ratio right now, say like in artillery, is 14-1. That means that the Ukrainians did not move their 1,500 artillery units they got into the battlefield at the point. I don't know how they're doing it, probably a few at a time to see how it goes. I know they have put the French Caesars up front there because they can shoot farther, and they can get an advantage, a strategic advantage there above, compared to the Russians. And so this is a fundamental question in this war, and this is probably part of it, why there is only limited, enthusiasm among the other European countries in how much ammunition and heavy equipment they want to deliver, looking at the numbers the Ukraine actually has available. I'm pretty sure that a lot of these tanks are stationed around the country, probably towards the Belarus border and other areas, but we haven't really seen any of these 2,400 tanks coming into action at this point. And theoretically, to supply this stuff in a war scenario, that would require a rather large manufacturing base for the ammunition. If you have that much equipment, 1,500 artillery units is a lot. If you think about it, that the Germans are going to send with the Dutch combined 12 of the Panzerfaust 2000, which is an artillery, a mobile artillery, or a self-powered, self-propelled artillery vehicle. And, 12 versus 1,500, good, they can shoot further, but you still need ammunition for it. And I guess that the 12 units is about corresponding of what the European countries can actually produce in terms of ammunition for this, and in spare parts to actually keep them alive. So there is more unanswered questions. It is possible that the information is out there, maybe in Ukrainian or in Russian, which I neither speak either language. I have not been able to find any clarification on this, which is rather more, all this is pretty much in a gray, dark area. And so these are the questions I would have. Technically, the Ukraine, from the numbers they have in equipment, they should be, on their own resources, quite capable of defending themselves. There should be no shortfall. But of course, if you don't plan for this, that the Russians going to shell your manufacturing facilities, which is one of the most logical things in a conflict that's going to happen, they should have moved them years ago into a very, very different part of the country, probably towards Lviv, as far away as from Russian and, Belarus border, basically, is closer to Poland over there in that area down there to the Czech Republic, that corner, that would have been a much better situation for them. This way they could have resupplied steel and parts from Poland and the Czech Republic very easily. Steel, whatever you may need in terms of it. Rather than doing their own tanks, they could have built it and then put up an air defense system around it and got this properly prepared. Because from what my understanding is, the NATO has been warning them for months that this was coming. And like I said in my other video, July 12th was when President Putin published his essay on how he sees this, the gospel according to Vladimir. So this is food for thought. There's some questions. There's also further the question on how much do we have to supply, how much do they really need, and how open are they with what they really got. Of course, that could be possibly that in confidential, communication between Zelensky and the other leaders of other European countries and Germany, they have given them the correct numbers. Of course, we want to support the Ukraine, but these are questions, which have to be answered at one point or another, especially when it is clear that you had that many tanks. How can you be not prepared for a war if you got 2,400 tanks in active duty and not be prepared for something like this and then run out of ammunition? So that is something which has to be explained at one point or another. That is something which does not add up. Let's put it this way. That basically concludes this. The one thing I want to say to all the battlefield developments at the moment is that we're really, really in a similar situation of what we had with World War One. Say like by 1915, shortly after the thing started, a half a year, 6 months, 8 months, 10 months into this, where this became a trench war, basically. You see movements. I'm following, the Ukrainian fellow there, Denis, and he explains this twice a day, and they move 2-3 kilometers, 5 kilometers this direction. Then the other side makes a counterattack. They lose the 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 kilometers. Now they're coming in on the Izum side from the east. That would be the west side. Trying to cut Izum off because they kind of slept through this. And there's some fighting down there in that region. By Odessa, or a little bit further east of Odessa. I forgot now the name of the town. And neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have made any major progress in this in either direction. They're basically wearing each other down. And of course, at the cost of ammunition and the life of soldiers and that sort of stuff, which is always tragic, especially if it is not that necessary. That is not really that necessary. On the other hand, as I understand the Ukrainians, when they say we're going to fight for every square inch, that's understandable. You don't want to yield anything to it, especially if you don't know if you can amass the equipment you need for a massive counterattack, which neither any of the European countries either would have. Of course, they say we have more modern weapons and everything else. So do the Russians. So if you're going to haul more of the European or the NATO equipment in there, then the Russians are probably going to haul something else on the other side. And they're going to equate that out a little bit. This is very, very difficult to predict. But in general, that's what I would say. Now, that basically concludes now the segment on Germany with their power and what they may do after the war. Not to offend the Russians too much, to get the gas back until they have worked out their plan. They want it by going to alternative energies by, I don't know, 20, whenever. and they wanted to use gas because it is cleaner burning than any other of the energies, and they didn't want to use nuclear power, which would have been the best alternative because you would have gotten rid immediately of CO2 all across the board. But, that's just my opinion in this. Now, the basically second or third topic tonight is Moore's Law. I will touch that for a few minutes. And I do not know if you have heard of Moore's Law. I forgot his first name, but Moore is an Intel fellow. He has been working with Intel for a long time. I think he's retired now, and he's either in his very late 70s or early 80s. And he was basically an active semiconductor designer at Intel. And he came up with the statement that the processing power will double every year. That means every 12 months we're going to have a processor which is twice as powerful as the previous one we had in the previous year. And that is an exponential function. And that means, and this was based on the transistor. If you may remember that the transistor was invented by Bell Laboratories by two scientists, and they were first made of germanium, which is one of the elements, and then later changed to silicon when they were able to dope silicon, because the silicon is more stable than germanium was. So the first transistors were in germanium, which then launched the race which enabled us to go to the moon, and it also spawned the entire industry of personal computers, mainframes, digital cameras, cell phones, and everything else we got today. And if you're my age, then you probably remember we kind of started out in the late 70s, early 80s with Commodore, computers. And then there was the Z80 mini computer and the Z81. They had a cassette tape player with it. They had a little 8-bit microcontroller in it, and it had a few kilobytes of RAM. And that was already gigantic back then because it was already bigger than what NASA had used in the 60s for their flight computer going to the moon. And then came the race with the 186s, the 286s, the 386s, the 486s. And then it went to the Pentium 1, Pentium 2, Pentium 3, and now we're Pentium 4, 5, 4, 4, 6, and that sort of stuff. And this was all based on Moore's Law, that basically the transistors, or the amount of transistors in the same area of semiconductor, the same surface space, would basically double every year. And there would be a day of the end coming where you cannot get any more, where you cannot physically produce any smaller transistors. And for that, I'm going to explain that a transistor, the smallest transistor you can build on silicon, has to have 10 atoms, ATOM, S for plural, atoms. Each atom has a width of 0.2 nanometers. Nanometers is the zeros past the dot. So a billion has 9 zeros and a nano has 9 zeros. The billion is before the dot, the nano is after the dot. So you have basically, it's very small, but you need 10 of them, which gives you 2 nanometers, or 2 billionths of a meter, for the minimum size, 10 atoms of a transistor. And that is the smallest one we can produce today. That's it. Once we reach this, that's the end of it. Silicon, you cannot go any further than this or any lower than that. You will need 10 atoms in it. For one is the size and the other one is the electrical stability. Otherwise, they're going to start oscillating if you use less than 10 atoms. And this year, Intel and AMD, the chip manufacturers, they have gotten to 14 nanometers. That is the current size of it. And as you probably know, the NASDAQ is going downhill faster than any other one of these indexes. And this is part of the overall scenario, because next year we're going to be at 7 nanometers in 2023. And in 2024, we're going to be then at 3.5 nanometers. And then in 2025, we're going to be at slightly less than 2 nanometers. So we're going to be basically done in 2024. We cannot make any more faster computers. That's the reality. Now, my computer is 7 years old. I have an Intel, I think they call them i3 chip in there, or an i5, running on 2 gigahertz with 8 gigabyte of RAM. And I use Windows 7. That is one of the most stable software platforms they have, 64-bit, with a 2 terabyte hard drive. And I have no issues whatsoever with my computer. All of the software I use for my business, for engineering, where I can design even the most complex circuit boards with up to 18 different layers stacked on top of each other, in every way, form, or shape, down to our size we're working with is 1 mil, which is 1/1000th of an inch. The holes they can drill now with laser drills is about 2 to 3 mil, 2/1000th to 3/1000th of an inch. On a physical platform, I can design this stuff with no problem. I can write software code on there, the most complex code, either in C or in assembler, the machine language which we use. And there's virtually nothing I could do. This is so far beyond what any one of us could have imagined in the 1980s, when these software packages, these software development platforms we're using, even FPGA design today, I can do on my computer with no problems. 30 years ago, you needed a supercomputer to do this. I can do this on that computer I got right now, and I paid $600 for it. It's an HP. So my computing upgrade needs to go with a faster or better Intel chip and new motherboard and all of the stuff came to an end already by 2015. I think that's when I bought the computer, 2015. And it is fine. It's with 8 gigabytes of RAM. Everything I do, I can put up to 64 gigabytes of RAM in that machine. That is far beyond anything I will ever use. And similarly now is the large corporations which would buy these new Intel chips on 14 nanometer wafer, or silicon. They basically are not buying them. And the reason for this is, ever since we got to 28 nanometers, the heat development got so big that these systems have to be cooled down with attachments to these quadrant chips on the backside, and they have to get cooling fluids, so it's similar to what you have in your car running, cooling your engine. And on the mainframe, they're all connected, and they have to basically climatize. The heat development is gigantic in them. And with each smaller transistor, they lowered the operating voltage, which increased the current. So the power consumption, when you have 1 billion transistors in a package 1 by 1 inch, so 1 square inch, in the next year you're going to be at 2 billion transistors, then you have basically doubled the heat and you have doubled the power consumption. The next year after this, so 2 years, you have quadrupled this from just 2 years ago, the heat output, and then so 16 times, 32 times, it just goes bigger and bigger and bigger. So we're now at a point where this becomes unfeasible, where it is no longer practical, and there is no need for any of these super chips, basically. And what I have seen now in Silicon Valley is that the old-time giants there, which are my age and probably 10 years older, are all retiring. They basically all got laid off. All of the designers of semiconductors basically have been letting go of. For one is the venture capital people went with, social platforms and widgets and apps, and what no one needs and has no purpose. They have been funding that kind of stuff, and it hasn't gotten them any returns because it is useless. And Intel, for the better part, they're going to bring their final chip-making facility back to the United States. That facility should be operational probably by 2025, 2027. And they're going to be building then these super chips here, and they're going to sell whatever they can, and they're going to be very expensive. And all the consumer type and medium grade, the stuff what I'm using, what you probably got in there, and the chips for the iPhones and that sort of stuff, the processors, they're going to be made in China or in Singapore or Malaysia or the Philippines, where they always have been made. But this is basically it. The end is here. The interesting thing is this: with all these gazillions of dollars all these venture capital people have, and all that money the federal government spends on R&D throughout all the different government branch or offices. It was clear about 15 or 18 years ago that we will reach this by this time now, where we are, 2024, 2025. And no one has been able to come up with a replacement for the silicon transistor. That is really stunning. Whether it is nanotechnology or anything else they have played around with, they have not come up in 15 years or 18 years with a viable replacement for the silicon-based transistor for another material which could go then even smaller, and you keep Moore's law going. That has not materialized. I know that they have made efforts around it, but there's nothing out there viable which is going to be available. Now we have basically reached a stage when we look at this of where R&D money is being spent today, or venture capital money, with the exception probably of Musk, with his SpaceX program. But then again, as he just buys stuff, he doesn't design anything new. They just buy parts and metal, and they build rockets. And it's the same with the automotive industry. The technologies, the photovoltaic cell was invented in the 1940s or 1950s. The nuclear fuel cell, which they use at space programs in conjunction with photovoltaic panels. All of our technology we have today was invented between, I would say, 1860 to 1950 for the better part. You look at the automobile is exactly the same way as it was when the gas engine was first invented. We have a steering, we have some form of a transmission in it, we have four wheels and a chassis around it. And the same is true for the electric vehicle. There has been virtually no changes in the automotive field. The car is the same as it was the day it was invented. And you have this the same with rockets. What Musk is doing is what Werner von Braun did. Werner von Braun started in 1920 in the Weimar Republic, which led to the V1 and the V2 rockets for Adolf Hitler. And then he came over here, the Americans brought him over here to do the Apollo and all the other missile projects, including the intercontinental ballistic missiles, which they did first because of the threat from the Soviet Union. Same technology. we got newer devices. Some things are easier and stuff like this. And however, the rocket engines designed on 3D computers today, they got 4,500 parts. The rocket engine for the Apollo rockets, which booted from 1961 and got all these people up there in outer space and under the moon and everything, had a total of 47 parts, all designed by hand and made by hand. No machining except of a lathe and those kind of, metal machining was involved, but no CNC machining. That gives you an idea. So our technology has reached a plateau where we have accomplished everything what was important to humanity, that is flying, driving, increasing our standard of living, and medical advances, in every single form. We basically have arrived at the top of the level. You probably can make some things better and better and better, and then you're going to come to a level, where there's no further past than where we are. And this point has been reached. This is now what elevated all of this, or what made this possible, was the invention of the transistor. And the transistor will be with us. We can make it down to that 2 nanometer level, and they probably will figure out how to get rid of the heat, but the power consumption is going to be there, and that's going to be it. I do not know if we ever need any more faster computers. Now, if you talk to your child and into gaming, they probably will tell you, yeah, we need to go further. The problem is none of these kids have any brain in order to take us past the silicon transistor. At least I haven't seen any one of them. They can tell you how great they can play this stuff on the computer with their friends, and how far they can go, and all of this stuff. But intellectually, it ain't there, just to put it that way, no matter what anyone else is going to tell you. So, is this going to change our world? Not really. I think we're all very comfortable. If we can get rid of the war, then, we start living and focusing on a peaceful world. It was all worthwhile living. But maybe one day we're going to have flying saucers as cars by some nuke engine, which doesn't create any radioactive waste or something like this. They promised it to us in the 50s. We have yet to see the flying saucers as a mode of transport for people. The drones, I'm not quite sure. The drone is a helicopter. Sikorsky flew his first helicopter in 1918, 1922, somewhere around there. It's been around for 100 years now, too. Drone, same principle as a helicopter. So none of these devices we have really have been anything breaking news new. The cell phone, what we have, the one device I'm using here, an iPhone, that is newer now for us. If you look at this just 10, 15 years ago in 2007, I had a small little Samsung phone, and it had a little camera in it, and it would make real bad videos, but you could record videos. Look how far we have come now. You can see this thing in HD. If you zoom in, you can see every minute defect I have, because I don't use any filters. So what do? We got the technology. It's so great. You can't either put makeup on it. If you don't want to put makeup on it, you download an app and you add a filter to your video, and you look 10 times better than what you actually do, or what you think you do. Yeah, that's kind of ironic, but I wanted to mention this. The end of Moore's Law is here. It's not going to be the end of the world. It is just a fact. The technology companies, the big years are over. the big fat days, Intel, AMD, yeah, HP computers and stuff like this, they still will sell computers and laptops and that stuff, but it's going to be a MacBook. It's going to be all on a much smaller, scale. And what we can do with these devices, like I said, is I can design anything today on my computer I have. And my computer is now 7 years old, and it was an off-the-shelf computer I ordered online for $699 with free shipping, including the keyboard. But no monitor, because I had a monitor, a flat screen monitor already, and a mouse. DVD-ROM I got in there, and then an X amount of USB ports. And this has lasted now for 7 years, even though Microsoft discontinued Windows 7. I got the disks, and I can repair everything. And I got all the drivers, there's no longer supported, but the anti-spyware stuff and the Microsoft security thing is still being updated. So nothing to worry there. That's just what I wanted to throw in. I think Peter Thiel and Musk are ways off with what they're thinking and how this is all going to play off and play out. We will see this in the end. With that, you have a great night, and we will see you probably next weekend.